the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And this is our last Kavli Conversation of this semester. So welcome, thank you all for coming. Those of you who are watching online, thank you very much for joining us. I want to welcome Azeen Ghorayshi and also Kate Clancy and thank them for being part of this. Rose Eveleth, our moderator, will formally introduce them. But I just want to say that I'm both sad and happy that we're devoting time to this topic. Sad that we need to devote time to this topic, but happy that we're doing it because it's so incredibly important. I'm grateful to many people for educating me on the topic, and one of them is our moderator, Rose Eveleth, who our guest moderator today, who is a podcaster extraordinaire and a wonderful writer, independent journalist. She's doing a project for ESPN currently. She also once speculated in a conversation with me who would be the first SHRP graduate to be a speaker at a Kavli at an evening event, and well, I think it turns out that it's her, and it's very well earned. So with that, I will turn it over to Rose Eveleth, and off we go.
Thanks. It is a little surreal to be here instead of there. Hi, Lee. If I do a really bad job, just let me know. You're free to heckle from the back there. Lee's usually in the seat here. This is a conversation about, I think the very clever title is Covering and Uncovering Harassment in Science. I also am not super excited to talk about it, but I think it's really important, and I don't think I could have two better people here to talk about it. And like Dan said, this is a conversation. We'll start it off, but if you do have questions and you want to chime in, feel free to. At the end, we will turn the cameras off in case you want to wait. If you don't want your face live streamed or your question live streamed, we'll do that. So I will do the introductions now of our esteemed panelists. Is this a panel or is it, I don't know. Does there have to be a table for there to be a panel? I don't know. So Azeen is a science reporter at BuzzFeed News. I'm reading from this because you both have extremely extensive resumes that I collated into this, so I'm going to try to make these as long as possible. She's reported on lots of things, including sexual harassment in science, but also other things, which we might get to towards the end. Before BuzzFeed, she studied neurogenetics at UC Berkeley. After that, she got a master's in science communication from the Imperial College London. And then started working for all sorts of places, Guardian, Newsweek, pretty much any publication you've heard of, she's probably written for it. And she has won both the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Award and the Clark Payne Award for Young Science Journalists. And my favorite thing, helped found a very lovely magazine called Method Quarterly, which is beautiful and was about sort of the way we think about science and sort of how it integrates with the world. Kate Clancy is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Illinois, who studies inclusion and diversity in science, as well as reproductive ecology and evolutionary medicine. Along with being a scientist, Kate was one of the first science bloggers, I think, that I probably started reading, which was very exciting. It's very exciting to have her here. She had a blog, I think she had a blog at Scientific American, and now you have an independent blog on your site, which you should all check out, including also her podcast, which is about periods, and it's amazing. I thought I knew a lot about periods. I learned a lot of things listening to that podcast about periods. So I'm excited to talk to both of you about sort of this space and this world and this beat and studying this. So let's start with the SAFER study. Can you kind of talk us through the origin story of the study that you did that sort of is like kind of one of the big ones in the field, I think, of harassment in science?
It's the one.
Sure.
The one,
yeah, well, the one for now, but there's definitely more on the horizon. What happened, I mean, it's kind of so it kind of gets back to the science blogging thing that I was doing a lot of science blogging. I wrote a lot about women in science issues, and I started to get sort of speaking gigs at various universities where they'd say, ooh, come talk to our lady scientists about the whole lady science thing. Maybe you can talk to them about that. And certainly a lot of the early talks I gave, I think were really unidimensional. I think probably much more white feminist than I would like them to have been, and I think they were really thinking a lot about agency of like the women. So like, yeah, ladies scientists, let's just work harder and we're all gonna make it, it's gonna be great. And we didn't talk a whole lot about institutional issues, even though like as someone who had a women's studies degree, these were things that I thought a lot about. Anyway, so I was at one of those that one of my friends invited me to, and afterwards we were talking. And we weren't that far apart in years in our PhD, and she wasn't finished. And I had this tenure track job, so I like teased her a little bit, and I was like, "Hey, come on, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and like, let's get going. I need you to have a professor gig like me, so we can do the professor thing together." And that's when she told me that, well, I really can't, because every time I look at my dissertation data, I have flashbacks, and I've been diagnosed with PTSD from the sexual assault that I experienced while I was in the field. And that was, especially as someone who was so near and dear to me, a really upsetting, for me, selfishly, an upsetting moment. I encouraged her, and soon after I met another person with a similar experience, to write pseudonymous stories on my blog. And then from there, I was invited to give a talk on these issues at an invited symposium for my professional society. And then, when you're invited, those of you in academia, like when you're invited to give a talk somewhere, you write the abstract, but you kind of write something real quick because you've been invited. The abstract should probably just be accepted. But instead, I got it kicked back and rejected because there was nothing empirical. I was only talking about people's experiences. So, are we allowed to swear here?
Totally up to you.
Okay, well, I was so annoyed at the response I got from my professional society that I was like, well, fuck you, I'm gonna do a survey then. And that was basically how the SAFE survey started, is I reached out to people that the people who are my collaborators on it, who I thought had marvelous expertise, and that the four of us together could handle the emotional load of doing the work together and also the actual load of doing the scholarship. And from there on, it's just sort of taken on a life of its own. But it started from this one person that meant a lot to me and still does.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of have a somewhat similar story of like, you didn't go out to be like, I'm going to be the sexual harassment reporter.
No, not
Can you
at
kind of
all.
talk about how you started working on those stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, BuzzFeed started a science desk in January of 2015. So I was the first reporter on board. And very soon, the MO of the desk was to sort of try to cover science stories that weren't being covered elsewhere, issues of power and money and stuff like that, but we didn't really know specifically what that meant. But from the very beginning, Ginny, my editor, said that sexism in science was something that we should cover, and to not shy away from things like Tim Hunt, for example, was something that obviously we were all over. And we just covered sort of the incremental things as they happened, and I think being embedded in a newsroom that had already done so much work around sexual assaults and rape on college campuses, I think we were sort of uniquely set up to handle a story like that. But ultimately, it was people like Kate laying the groundwork that made people feel comfortable going public with a story like this in the first place. And we were sort of lucky, I think, ultimately, but also had hopefully proven ourselves that they could trust us. Trust is a huge, I think, factor in doing any of these stories, that they came to us. So, yeah, we definitely did not start out. That was like in the background. We knew, the representation issues in STEM, the leaky pipeline, these were all like things, but it was like sort of in this like abstract, hazy space for a while, until people came forward and were like, we have really horrible stories and we'd like to share them with you. So,
one of the things that surprised me a little bit, particularly about the SAFER study, is that it really was the first one. I had sort of been like, oh, there must be other research like this when I had first heard about it, and I looked, and there wasn't any at all, which is sort of surprising to me, at least. Maybe that's naive, maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, but were you surprised that there wasn't really any empirical survey stuff on this before?
Well, there wasn't empirical survey stuff on it in science climates, but there were plenty of, if you actually dig, there are a lot of people who've been writing about this for a really long time. And the thing is they mostly have been writing from personal experience. So they're either writing case studies or they're writing autoethnography, so personal stories of their experiences in the field. And unfortunately, in a quantitative field like biological anthropology and a lot of other field sciences, those lived experiences were really undervalued. So people didn't pay a lot of attention to them. And then there is an entire discipline, some of whom are now my collaborators, of people who study workplace aggression. And they maybe were not turning their attention to the sciences necessarily, but they were looking at plenty of other high-powered places where these, incivilities and harassment and assault are happening. And I think I think we scientists love setting ourselves apart and thinking we're really special and different. And so we never looked at that literature and said, I wonder if that's kind of how it is with us.
Which is part
Let's
of the
do
problem,
our own thing.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and I want to, I think that like, the question that sometimes comes up when these stories get published, because a lot of your stories are about like a particular field, and people will say like, oh, maybe it's just, astronomy. Maybe that's the only place where this problem is, or maybe it's only philosophy when these stories come up. And I wonder if you guys, feel like, is science in any way different? Or is it really just part and parcel of this bigger field of research on this stuff, or even stories about this?
I mean, I think with the astronomy thing, there was a very clear group of people who was like younger scientists in the astronomy community who were deciding like they were not going to stand for this stuff anymore. And they decided to shed light on issues that have been happening for an extremely long time. So I think the astronomy thing, but then there is a huge gender difference in tenured faculty members in the astronomy community. So it's definitely possible that it's happening more there. But I think in science more generally, I mean, a lot of people, most famously recently Neil deGrasse Tyson said that science is not unique. There's harassment is everywhere. It's in workplaces. There's power differentials everywhere. But there are certain factors that are unique to science that would make these problems, and I think particularly silencing these problems, a bigger issue. And I think the whole hierarchy of working up to be a scientist is so already impossible. Why would you ever want to come out and cause trouble, something like this? Grant money is something that's come up in every single one of the stories we've done. If you're a scientist who's bringing in $30 million in active grants to your university, sure, they may not be statedly making their decisions based on financials, but it's there and it's undeniably, present in this systemic problem. I think it is. There are things about how science is structured that make it harder for people to speak up about these things.
Mm-hmm. And there are people who study the responsible conduct of research and the culture of science and how those things intersect. And a lot of the unethical behavior or scientific misconduct that you see, and I would put interpersonal issues, incivilities, harassment, and assault into scientific misconduct, because if you're being sexually harassed in the lab, you might leave something on a hot plate too long and it explodes because you are, you know what I mean? Like if you are dealing with incivilities in your laboratory or in your field, these things trickle down and affect safety issues and other types of ethical issues in the science that you do. And if you are, and so to me, they're all sort of the same thing. And folks who've been studying responsible conduct of research have said exactly what you're saying, which is that when you have these star systems where the eminence of a scholar makes people decide to maybe overlook certain things, when grant money and quantity of publications and where you're placing your articles is what's prioritized, then how you get there, that process of science is part of what gets lost. And there's folks like Tina Gonzalez at the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics, who's at the University of Illinois with me, who's done some really important work in that area. And it just becomes so easy to forgive the first small infraction, and then you don't realize 20 infractions later that you have a serial sexual harasser that you've been supporting for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And it really puts the burden on like the most vulnerable in the population to have to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to back up before we get into just some of these big picture questions and just talk a little bit more about some of the methodologies here, both sort of for the science and for the journalism, sort of how you actually sort of go about gathering this information, talking to people, getting people to trust you, that kind of thing. And you have pretty different ways of going about this in some ways because like you're gathering a lot of stories and you're kind of picking some to focus on. So I'm wondering how do you get people to like, well, maybe you should talk about like what is the methodology of the SAFE survey and then how did you get people to feel comfortable giving you, I mean, these are very sensitive stories that like you don't necessarily just want to tell anybody on the street, right? Like how do you get people to trust you?
For at least the two surveys that I've been a part of so far, the SAFE study and another one that's hopefully going to be out soon, We've done what's called snowball sampling. So, you reach out through social media outlets, through departments, through professional societies. You might get it out the first time, but also once you start getting some people filling out your survey, you then say, can you pass this out to your friends? Can you recommend, so we're just sort of using social networks to have people reach out. And so then the person that they're hearing from is someone that they know and trust, and they're maybe more likely to fill out the survey. The thing that's tricky with the survey is that we also obviously have people who are very against the aims of the survey who fill out the survey. And so we have people who are going in and saying, none of these things ever happen. And then if there's any open box where they can fill anything, they'll write very hateful things about how we're going to ruin science by daring to do this kind of work. Or like, I've never seen any of this and therefore it's never happened. Or we've gotten reviewer
amazing how that
comments
works.
Yeah. But then for the interviews, which in each case so far with methodologies I've done so far, is we get the interviews from people who've agreed to be contacted after doing the survey. That's been really interesting and field different, different in different fields. So among field scientists and anthropologists, because I'm an anthropologist, I think that maybe made it easier. Again, that social network piece, I think more people were willing to talk to me. And so then I feel like that recruitment process was easier. In the other discipline that I'm doing some work in right now, they have no reason to know me or trust me. And there's also just some major cultural differences in that field that I think make it so that it's a lot harder for them to open up. And even when you ask a question that's not a yes or no question, you get a yes or no answer instead of elaborating. And it's just been kind of like pulling teeth to try to develop those stories.
So when you're looking at, you've got the survey, people fill it out. Is there language at the top to kind of like try to ease them into it? I mean, do you think about that? What is the kind of like way to, because it's a little bit impersonal when you're giving someone a survey as opposed to maybe sitting down with them and establishing that trust. I mean, how do you kind of, convince somebody via a form that they're filling out? Or is there specific language at the top that you think about?
Yeah, I mean, just like I imagine you'll be able to answer this question from a journalistic point of view. You have a code of ethics. I imagine that you are supposed to be bound to in terms of respecting the people that you are talking to. We have human subjects committees or institutional review boards, and we're required to go through them before we go out and do any of this type of research. And so we have to get approval from them in terms of how we write it. And when we're talking about sensitive topics, usually it's in our best interest and the best interest of potential participants to be clear about that up front. Even though we framed it as like a workplace experiences survey, we also wanted to say this could mean negative things could come up, and here are some, some phone numbers that you could call, if you're triggered by any of this. And in fact, we had a number of people who saw that front page, and we knew we'd lose people with that, but it's just also the right way to do it, who wrote us and said, I'd love to fill this out, but I'm afraid of being triggered if I tell you my experiences. So I actually think we ended up with fewer people who had traumatic experiences than a lot of people think our sample bias goes the other way, but I actually think we end up in some ways with lower numbers because of the fact that it's traumatizing to actually relive those experiences and tell them to somebody again.
Do you feel like it's different now because people know you and your work and sort of it's more established now than in 2014 when the SAFE study came out, that people are more willing to sort of go there? Or?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say because I don't have a good before and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I don't really know. In some ways I think it's made things easier. In other ways I think those of us who do this work are maybe then seen as more notorious. So then it's like you kind of can't win.
Yeah.
I don't know what your experience has been because I mean now that you've been covering that beat, if that's become easier or harder for you.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely changed. I think with the Marcy story, I mean all of the people who eventually filed the complaint at UC Berkeley, there had been there were many like chaperones in that process, sort of senior people who talked to other senior people. Joan Schmeltz, who ran the Women in Astronomy blog, she had initially like blogged about something about a serial harasser, I think, and then women started writing to her. She really, there were stewards in this process that then eventually, when they realized that Berkeley wasn't going to do anything about it, and they realized they wanted to go public, sort of asked people who recommended, and they sort of navigated and ended up with us. But I think since the Marcy story, we have gotten, now people, I think, to some extent know that they can come to us and expect that we will hopefully do a good job. In terms of establishing that trust with people on a case-by-case basis, it's hard. People these are often women who have been denied at multiple steps of this process of trying to bring something forward. So I think initially when I talk to them, I like to suggest that we can talk off the record, just like as a person, so I can hear their story, for example, and establish sort of the contours of what is going on here, because so many times it's hard to tell. What did the university do? Did you file a complaint? Did you ever talk to the chair of your department? What happened? And that's a hard thing for most people to tell when they feel like they're talking to a journalist, and that it's somehow like, there's this misconception that it'll like be out there. Once they've said it, it'll like be out there. And so I also try to explain sort of the process of what writing these stories will be like, what, the checks that we're going to go through, and that I'll have to reach out to other people, that I will have to reach out to the PI or whoever, that there will be difficulties along the way. But to sort of, I think, lay that out at the beginning, to be like, this is what it is to speak on the record, and this is what your options in terms of using your name, for example, to be like, to demystify the whole process of going public, I think is helpful. But that first conversation too is a way for them to open up more, just more frankly about what happened and what they're scared of too. But then throughout the rest of the process, I think you were asking about that, right?
Yeah, we can get there. Because you have to sort of fact check in a way that, like, for the study, you don't have to call anybody and say, was this complaint filed or anything like that, but you sort of do, and that's like a tough spot to be in, because you convince someone to trust you, and then you have to kind of go and do all these other things that they might perceive as not trusting.
Questioning, right? And I mean, they provide you with a lot of information, some of which, I have to tell the story. My job is I'm not an activist, I'm not an advocate. I'm a journalist. I have to tell the story as I see it. And sometimes there's uncomfortable things in there that I think are important to address, so that people don't have this fairy tale image too of like the perfect harassment case where someone is like purely innocent and another person is like purely a perpetrator. These things are complicated, and addressing that can help, make so people can't just like say you're discredited because there's like flaws in the story or whatever. But just, being upfront about that. So asking them to hand over, I think in all of the cases that we did, all of them, there were official complaints filed with the university. But, getting those investigation documents, Title IX investigations, correspondence, that stuff is really helpful, because not only do I have to prove my story ultimately to my editor, but we have a legal team at BuzzFeed. Our First Amendment lawyer is incredible and has worked on a lot of these stories, but she is going to be like, do you have, that's a thing that is kind of popping out of the page at me. Do you have 5, what are your corroborating sources on that? And you have to, I think you mentioned UVA before and Rolling Stone, that really raised the bar in terms of, we won't use pseudonyms for people. You can use your name, or you can use, you can go anonymous, or we can use like a middle name or some other identifier, but things like that to make sure that to show that we are doing our due diligence in terms of reporting the story as it exists.
Mm-hmm. When you're going through the survey and you're deciding who to interview, and the process is probably very different from you, because you probably get a lot of cases that people will send you emails and you have to pick sort of which ones to talk about, and you sort of have to pick. It's a very different process for you too, but can we start with like, how do you go through the survey and say, okay, I want to interview? Is it just anybody who said they will be interviewed, or do you pick people, and what are you looking for?
Either of those methodologies is often used, where you just go, you just like sort your Excel sheet by who said yes versus who said no, and then you just try everybody. And that's close to what we did. The piece that we added is we wanted to, so I didn't pay attention to what the stories were. I didn't look at like the survey data. I looked at among the yeses. We wanted to try to improve the diversity of the sample a little bit and have better representation around sexual orientation and race. And so I looked at those a little bit and tried to oversample a little bit from those groups. And even doing that, we improved the sample a tiny bit for the surveys, but not by, only slightly better than the overall sample. And so for us, again, the priority was as we move forward, as the project progressed and some other projects of mine progressed, we increasingly were thinking about how can we be more intersectional in our approach to this and really explicitly draw out variation in lived experiences. And understand that people with multiple layers of marginality might have really different experiences of not only being harassed, but then what happens when they actually go and try to, like what are the different obstacles they're facing as they're trying to go to Title IX or going to their field site director or whatever issue that they're, whoever they're going to first to report.
And you mentioned that some people would sort of go into the survey and be like, this is nonsense, like I don't see it so it doesn't exist, which is like not how science is done. But did you ever worry about like someone going in and like fabricating a story? Like did you ever like try to check for any of that kind of stuff?
No, I mean, and generally, again, like in our field, and this is like sort of evolutionary theory of me, but in any system that you build, there's like some tiny percentage of cheaters, perhaps. Like you can build a system where you prioritize punishing cheaters, or you can build a system that is as inclusive as possible. And so, of over 600 surveys, is there a chance that one of them is a different representation of the story than a different person would have? Maybe, but I don't know. And it's not, to me, that's far less important than the overall impact of that data set. And I think people put a lot on the veracity of these stories and a lot of attention on that in a way that they don't in other types of social science research. So I'm in the social sciences. This is just one type of social science work that I do. And other people I know who do different types of social science, they don't get attacked. They don't have trolls. They don't have men's rights activists writing them every day like we do. So, they're criticized, so the critiques are the same that you'd have of any methodology, but they're made very personal just because we happen to be doing something that people don't want us to be doing.
Right. And I mean, also like you said, it's like within the context of a large data set, whereas like if you do one story about one person and that winds up not being fully accurate in whatever way, then it's a lot harder. It's harder for like a journalist to sort of, you don't have the other data to be like, but also we have 599 others that like are in here. When you sort of now probably get a lot of emails about this, or maybe not, but I mean, how do you decide after that Marcy story, like which stories to look into and sort of who to talk to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of changed along the way, but we got a lot of responses after the Marcy story, and it was sort of like almost overwhelming. And I would try to talk to as many of them as possible. The next story that we published was out of Caltech, a professor there, and then we did another story last May at UW. And in each of those stories, the Caltech one was interesting because I then interviewed, I think, 9 or so of graduate students who had left his lab. He had just recently been tenured. It was clearly an issue of like a young person, very promising young rising star who it had been completely overlooked that he had a lot of problems with managing students, being a mentor, sort of doing that side of being a PI that is maybe less important in terms of publishing a bunch of stuff that's important for Caltech, And so that story it sort of made clear like there are different facets of this problem or different things that sort of feed into the same systemic thing. And that's sort of been, going forward, the Kate's story was interesting and different in that it sort of made explicit that this, he had actually sued the University of Washington when the investigation, the sexual harassment investigation was taking place, because they had placed him on home assignment. And so he wasn't able to go in and do his research. And he sued the university, which made this case public, which is how I found out about it. A tipster was like, you should go on Pacer and search for, and I was like, oh wow, it's like all there. Like this is like a lot of reporting work just on the public record. But he had sued the university claiming that they had violated his tenure rights by not allowing him to do his research. And it sort of, in his complaint, he was like, I bring in $30 million to this university, like my research has been featured in this many, I've written this many papers. Like he made explicit all of these things that sort of feed into why he felt like that his science was more important than how he treated the people in his lab. So I think in doing each of these stories, we try to look for new part there. I mean, there's a lot that feeds into this, so new parts of it. And then, going forward since then, I still get emails, and a lot of times it doesn't pan out, not because we decided to not do a story, but because it's like a lot to ask of a person to come forward and potentially use their name. Most of these people are still grad students. They need to like get postdocs, apply for stuff still, and like are scared of, what Google is going to turn up and change for them potentially. And so a lot of times, I'll have several conversations with someone and they will at some point say like, I'm sorry, like this is not something I'm ready to do. And at that point, you just have to sort of back off. Like that's it's their story to tell. And like, the Cates case was weird because he had put it out there in public, but in all of the other cases, it's really a matter of these people making the choice to share this.
Do you ever feel like someone comes to you and like really wants to tell the story and you kind of have to talk them almost out of it because they don't quite understand what they're getting themselves into?
Well, I think that's that conversation that I was talking about where I'm like, I'm going to have to like ask you a million questions about this like horrible thing. And I'm going to have to like I'm going to have to call, other people who were in the lab at the time and like find out what they know. And like people are going to call you into question, like even in the course of just my reporting probably. So I think giving them a heads up about like what they're going to face is helpful, but it's still hard. I mean, I think at many points in the reporting process and then once it's published, I think it's a difficult position to be in sort of throughout.
For both of you, just like in working on this is like a very stressful topic to have to hear about and think about and work on all day. I mean, how do you two keep yourselves from just feeling despair constantly? Just a perennial question.
Personally, I'd say in the beginning I didn't. I mean, I started doing this in 2013, and that's when we first presented just the preliminary results, and then the paper was, our first paper came out in 2014, and that was actually one of the harder periods of my life. I hadn't quite learned that term, that vicarious traumatization, the ways in which you can be traumatized by the things that you're hearing, and I'd hit a point where I felt like I had hundreds of harassment and assault stories in my head, and that got really hard. And having recordings and transcripts that you have to listen to over and over again in order to do thematic analyses. Again, I'm sure you guys are doing the same thing when you're listening to interviews, and like you put those headphones on and you listen to that person telling their story, and you get re-traumatized in the process too, just as they are by daring and being brave enough to tell you in that moment. So for me, it was actually incredibly hard. And I think part of what helped me is, thankfully, some of my other research was kind of going well at that time, and I had to go to the field, and so I was like when the right before the paper hit, I was in rural Poland, dealing with.
You're one of those scientists the journalists hate because they're like, well, we need a comment, and you're like, can't, I'm in Poland.
Yeah, like I'm 7-hour time difference. Oh, it was right beforehand. So I got whooping cough from my roller derby teammate, and then I went to Poland not knowing I had it yet, just thinking I had a bad cold. No. Thankfully, nobody got it there, which was good because I was once I realized afterwards it was terrifying. But then I'm there helping my students, collect pee, because that's what I do. I transvaginal ultrasound people to study their endometria, and I collect pee. And so we're like setting up all that stuff and working with our new vacuum aliquots. And so it allowed me to just, I knew this big thing was coming and it was going to break in about a week, and I was able to be somewhere else. And I think that made a huge difference. That and literally not being able to breathe for a couple of weeks because I was dealing with whooping cough. All the interviews, if you hear any of them, my voice sounds like really awful. So I think that just snapped me out of it a little bit. And then I started seeking, I didn't seek any professional help, but I did start reaching out to my friends and leaning on them more than I think I had before. Again, like I said, I play roller derby. I play a sport that is about women supporting each other in a really feminist, cool way. And I think that they're the people in some ways more than anything that got me through it.
Yeah, I would say people helped. One of my closest friends has been reporting on sexual assault and rape on college campuses and sort of that whole movement for years and years. And Katie Baker at BuzzFeed, and she, like anything I told her, she was like, oh yeah, like here's how you deal, And we have one of the amazing editors besides Ginny who was working on the stories was this woman, Arielle Kaminer, who had come from the Times, had reported on like Horace Mann, like back in the day. She's sort of like the most calming, sort of like we've got this, like, take care of yourself, etc. But for the most part, I think the hardest thing for me was managing the expectations of these women who are coming forward. And like, you shoulder a lot in telling someone's story in such a granular way. So, remembering that at the end of the day, I was still just a reporter, and that, I had to do my best in terms of telling the story, but my job is not to be like fighting on the streets, for things that, I believe in. That's not what I'm paid to do in terms of telling these stories. So yeah, I think that was maybe the hardest thing for me, is like dealing with, because to get someone to trust you too, you have to, particularly for these types of stories, you really have to empathize, and that level of emotional giving that you have to sort of put out there to hear these stories is hard. It just gets hard to draw the line again for yourself. And so that was something I had to sort of continuously remind myself to do,
Is that a question, Danny?
Sure, yeah.
Sure, as if you were just standing there by the mic. Oh, me?
Call on me. It's all about me. Yeah, I thought I would start just to get the ball rolling here, to encourage others to come on up. So I've been thinking about this, and in this context, and it pops up a lot in journalism, and that is the tension between the reporting of the individual case and the systemic issues. And I'm cheating a little because I heard Azeen and Kate talking about this beforehand, and I'm like, no, don't talk about this now. Talk about it once you're on camera, once everyone knows it. Because this is really difficult. I mean, Azeen, is it your feeling that all of these individual cases, deserve attention, which they certainly do appear to? So does that mean that they're all going to be covered in sort of in a granular way? And if so, is it, I don't know, are there some risks associated with that some people might see it as somehow exploitive, or sort of failing to sort of pull back and look at the big picture. But if we stop reporting these individual cases, that's a terrible track too, because then we're losing the accountability that's so incredibly important. So how do you manage that line between the granular micro and sort of the macro systemic issues? And I'm sure Kate has some thoughts about that too.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, these are questions that, I ask myself, and that me and Ginny talk about all the time. It's sort of, do we keep naming names? Is that the purpose here? I think there was a discussion on Twitter that I thought was really interesting. I think last year, maybe late last year, Janet Stemweedle and some people talking about, like, to what end? Do we keep doing this? Are these stories becoming like somehow tiresome, or and I think it's important to ask that question. I think, again, like what I was saying before, I think there are still more facets to show to this problem, and I think that's something we try to keep in mind in terms of future stories that we're working on. But I also think solving this problem is not just going to come. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of legwork at the level of these institutions, these professional societies, and that's happening. But I think it's worth sort of putting people's feet to the fire and reminding them in a way that I think kind of can hurt them more, in a way, to have like a big BuzzFeed story that's like very embarrassing for your institution. I mean, Berkeley is I went to Berkeley, and it makes me sad, but it's like up in flames right now because they have not only dealt with the case that I did, but they recently dealt with a famous philosopher, one of their most famous philosophers that they named a building after. I think maybe that even happened after complaints had been they have this is still happening, and to say like, oh, now we know it's a problem. Now there are like 4 or 5 big stories out there, like, we got it, like, slow down, like, we don't need to hear any more of this, it's too much. I think that's a little bit like, I understand where that discomfort comes from, but like, this problem is not gone, and it's not going to go away for a long time. And so as these things keep coming up, I think it is important for us to keep reporting on it. But I do think there is something to be said for looking for those, things that have not been shown, to show like just how deep the systemic issues go, and not just focusing on sort of the gory details, because those, we at least, women, know those exist. We don't need to be reminded. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the piece that I'd add is I think the reason that journalists are continuing to hear from victims of harassment and assault are because they're intensely and understandably completely dissatisfied with any other reporting mechanism to have anything done about it. And so until we clean up our own mess inside these various professional societies and disciplines, and create more extra legal options to actually resolve some of these issues, they're going to encounter these issues of, like the thing is Title IX is unfortunately comes from a good place, but is not super useful. It turns out it's really, especially since the Dear Colleague letter during the Obama administration, which again came from this great place of like, let's get more people reporting on how much rape is really happening on these campuses. Now you got to tell us the numbers, and now you have to have training, and now you have to have an office, and it was unfunded. So everyone just freaked out and created all of these compliance mechanisms. So now I have to take the weirdest online training with this weird cartoon, like a sexual harassment training where the cartoon mouth doesn't match like what she's saying. And then it's clearly like a training that's for lots of different universities, because it's like, click this link to find out your university's definition of sexual harassment. I'm like, there are different definitions of sexual harassment? And so there's this way where a lot of the scholarship now around people who study incivilities and harassment and assault, they really recommend that we create extra legal mechanisms. So stop saying you have to fit the legal definition of harassment for it to be actionable. You can just say, we hold different values in this department. We say that these things are not okay, and we will look into detenuring you, or we will look into making life really unpleasant for you, or we will tell you you can't have grad students anymore, or whatever the, at least that's not great, but at least it's something. You know what I mean? And until more professional societies and various academic units decide to start taking that on themselves, I don't see your phone stopping ringing anytime soon.
I mean, people file those complaints with the Title IX office because they went to their chair and their chair didn't do anything about it. Oftentimes, I mean, that has come up repeatedly.
Sure.
And I should just state, 2 out of 3 of the big stories we've written, 2 out of 3 of those professors are still employed by their universities. So clearly, the official mechanisms are.
Well, and just this way of sort of not taking responsibility. So I also know of cases where the department head has been incredibly supportive and has been like, I will go with you to this office, I will fill this out with you, but that's still passing the buck because it's saying, let's make it a legal thing, when the definition for legal harassment is, depending on the university, can be very, very, very high, because it's in the best interest of a university to make that definition really unattainable so that very few of these cases ever actually get done, right? I mean, if you think about it, that's how you avoid liability, is to say, oh, that's not really harassment, whatever that experience was. And so, any time, whether the department head is like, yeah, whatever, that's hilarious, I don't think that happened, or I agree, let's go, it's still the department head not saying, no, it stops with me, it's saying, let me pass it up. So either way, it's not solving the problem in-house,
I want to borrow a phrase from Lee, linger on something that you that you said about like sort of rehashing the gory details, because I think that is something that I've definitely noticed in some of the ways that sometimes this gets reported, is that people are like almost more interested in like literally what specifically happened than kind of like why it happened or what could be done. And I mean, I know that like I get asked to talk about like doxing and harassment all the time, and like people are much more interested in hearing about it and then feeling good that they know about it and then not really doing anything. And so I'm curious like how you think about moving forward in your work. Like how do you kind of you have to kind of talk about like this is what happens, and then but how do you get people to that next stage where it's like it's actually not really about the specific thing, or like how many dudes showed up at my house like telling me they were going to kill me. It's actually about like why did this happen in the first place, and no one ever wants to hear that second part. They just want to feel good that they like are aware of the problem and read about these kind of like spicy, like gory, kind of like weird details. Like how do you move past that part to get to that other side?
I think that's maybe something we've been cognizant of from the beginning, I hope. But like, you have to state that, right? And that's something you have to get over, sort of, what are the allegations that are being made? And then what is each person's response? To me, the fascinating part is definitely the like, let's take a step back and see how this went back to like 1995 in the case of Marcy. This came up in 2015. So this is 20 years before. I think that contextualizing, if you do the work to find it, we did a story after the first Marcy story came out that showed that, complaints had been raised when he was at SF State, as he was like a rising star in exoplanets. And to me, like, that's so much more fascinating, that this really shows the extent of the problem more so than, exactly where he touched on like that is not, to me, telling. And I think that's what we've tried to focus on. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely I can see the tweets and stuff, like what people pull out. And like for the Christian Ott story at Caltech, like everyone was obsessed with the fact that he had written posted 86 love poems about this grad student who he'd become obsessed with on Tumblr. And, those things do stick out to people. They are, details that I think get across what this feels like. It's just important to not focus. That's not what the attention should necessarily solely focus on. It's the big picture, the systemic issue that I think is more interesting ultimately. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a complaint that I take seriously and that I'm like aware of when I read other stories like this. I think that, again, UVA was an example where like it really focused on those details, and in the end it ended up being, so.
I also wonder to what extent, because I do think that you have gone about this in a really careful, thoughtful way, and that's why I've admired your work around this so much. And I've talked to, over the last couple of years, a lot of journalists about this. And one of the really, I think one of the worst conversations I ever had was someone who said to me, and this was a white male journalist who, I'm guessing this was never part of his lived experience of ever being harassed and assaulted, and I've been both. So, this moment where he said, "Give me your worst rape stories." That was literally the phrase he said to me. And I just remember he lost my trust completely. There were already things happening before that point that made me question whether I should trust him, but that was the moment where I actually went over his head to a female editor and was like, this is a problem, because I just couldn't believe that was, and that's not the first time I've had that kind of an interaction with a journalist. For the most part, it's not like that, but there've been a few times where that's been the interaction, and I hope that folks who do that kind of thing maybe realize they might be losing our trust when that's what they're asking, instead of taking that bigger picture perspective and saying, okay, well, maybe we should be worrying about the structural issues, not like what's the juiciest, most horrible thing you can tell me.
You're better than I would have hung up on him immediately. I just been like, that's it. We're done with this conversation. Ivan.
Yeah, so thank all three of you for the terrific work you do. It's difficult work, it's challenging, and you get more and more pushback and harmful things happening than should be. And as I think you all know, and we all know each other, at least electronically, I think a lot about misconduct, scientific misconduct. And I wanted to go back to something in all of these conversations, all of the discussion you're having about, you report on individual cases, you talk about the lurid details, and what does this mean for, and really what is the process? Do people, are universities doing the right thing? There's so many parallels. There are obvious huge differences too. And that sort of brings me to my question. And I'm interested, Kate, because this came up and you were talking about, I think it was, I'm going to say Bunsen burner. I don't think it was Bunsen burner, but you're in the lab and you're getting distracted and you leave something, going, and therefore, actually, sexual harassment does turn into scientific misconduct or has parallels. And then, as I'm sure you know, there's a discussion. The American Geophysical Union is actually sort of putting forward an idea, a proposal that they be that sexual harassment be considered scientific misconduct. I have to say, I don't have an opinion on that yet. It's something I will probably have an opinion on soon, but I don't have an opinion on that, and I'm wondering, in particular, Kate, any of you really, but because you had mentioned it, Kate, what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I see both systems. I see the processes for dealing with both problems as so horribly flawed that it's sort of like putting two horrible problems together and expecting, a great result. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. In fact, I think we need to fix both systems. I'm just curious what you think about that.
So I had a recent conversation with some other scholars in the field about this, where we also were kind of divided about, do we want to, and there were AGU folks in the room, so we were having a conversation. This was in a public session. So I'm not talking about anything confidential here, but we were having exactly this conversation of, is scientific misconduct and interpersonal misconduct, are these different things, or can we put things like different types of interpersonal misconduct, where I would say, microaggressions, incivilities, harassment, assault fall under that. Should we be placing that under scientific misconduct as a way to help scientists understand better that these things are bad? Because apparently it's not enough that harassment's bad. It has to affect the science for it to be bad to scientists. And I wish that wasn't the case, but that has been my experience more often than I would like to be the case. And so, but there were definitely people who don't. Personally, I don't think it's a terrible idea. I think folks who have more of a legal mind than I do are thinking about some of the long-term, the long-term consequences of that. Like, what does that mean long-term? For me, short-term, my best thinking at the time, which may also change, is I think that it is a great way to frame it for people who think that it's only okay to be not nice to people if it actually affects your science. I'm not saying that that's personally the value system I hold, but again, scientists like to set themselves apart and think that what we're doing is so much better and more important than other scholarship or other types of work in the world, and maybe this is a way to get them to recognize it.
The challenge there, though, is that if you can't prove that it impacted the science, does it still count in there, right? Like, then you wind up in an odd situation where you have to prove that something actually impacted the data, which is already another burden of proof on people, which is tough.
What does it mean to impact the science, right? If someone left your lab because of something that happened that fell in the sexual harassment realm, does that person's work is no longer included? Does that impact the science? Probably, right?
But you could imagine somebody saying, well, I'll just hire another grad student. They're essentially replaceable. You know what I mean? I just feel like you end up in this weird, I totally see that argument. And I think that's sort of what I was thinking about too when I saw the same proposal. I was like, oh, this will make people take it seriously when they aren't taking it seriously. But then you end up with that other side of it where if it's something that happens, after the person is off work hours and maybe it does, then you end up having to make this kind of weird argument that if you can't prove that it impacted the science, and then you might have to have a definition for that, and then it sort of becomes this whole other conversation.
I guess my understanding of the folks who are proposing this are that you don't have that additional burden of proof. It, by definition, falls under scientific misconduct. If you're doing it, it's scientific, it counts as this. So I agree with you. If there was if that created a second burden of proof, you have to prove it affects the science, that would be a problem. I don't think that's where people are going with it, but I could definitely see that happening with some institutions. A way is to protect themselves, right? Make it harder for somebody to be found guilty. So let's add this layer. There, folks who do this kind of work just in workplace aggression more generally have shown very clearly across many, many different workplaces that even minor incivilities create massive shifts in job turnover intentions, in productivity. There is actually a massive literature to support that if you are just as simple as just making somebody feel a little tiny bit unwelcome every now and then, that affects their productivity. So you can imagine that things like sexual harassment and assault are going to have pretty massive career consequences and consequences for the quality of the science.
Yeah.
Ott had just graduated, I think, in the time that we had written the story, 2 grad students in his lab. Only 2 had ever gotten their PhDs. 9 had left. He fired 1, and that was what our story was about. And that came in the case of Marcy, women were warned to not join his lab. What does that do to the work the lab creates? I don't know. I think that the line is so blurry, and seeking for a distinction makes certain things problematic. But this came up recently. We were actually discussing it on our desk. Someone published a paper recently it was sort of shocking because no longer a working scientist, And we were sort of like, oh, what does this mean? It gets that the whole line of argument about, is rehabilitation possible? Rehabilitation, should these people get jobs elsewhere? Like, should they be allowed to continue being scientists? And I think for something like scientific misconduct, I mean, Ivan would know much better than I would, but I think that's such a mark on you as a scientist to be, that your scientific work was called into question, and it is not clear so much that sexual harassment right now falls into the same category. I mean, these, like I said, 2 out of 3 are still employed. People are still publishing work. Should you be able to move to another university? Should you just no longer have access to students? Marcy's case involved undergrads. Should that have just been, the situation that Berkeley set up? It's unclear, but I do think it does play into the work they produce in ways that are less clear and sort of hard to put down as requirements.
Even cases of scientific misconduct regularly get buried by universities. And so unless somebody goes to a journalist and says, I want you to write a story on this, let me tell you all these things, it's just as easy to pass the non-ethical scientist to the next university as it is to pass the harasser right now. Because so many universities are not thinking from a values-based perspective, but a liability perspective. So they're not thinking, what would we be proud to be as an institution? How can we lead and do the right thing? They're instead thinking, how can we keep from getting people to find out about this and then, not liking us or getting sued because of it? So from at least just the handful of anecdotal cases I know of these kinds of things where it's an open secret that this person fudges their data or this person sleeps with all their grad students or whatever. If they've got sufficient privilege, particularly if they're white and male, it doesn't really seem to hurt them very much. As soon as you start to take steps away from sort of the dominant identity groups in our culture, then I think that's when you start to be more at risk.
Mm-hmm. And in the Kate's case, I just remembered there were something like 7 complaints filed, official complaints filed about him prior to the sexual harassment complaint that eventually led to the whole thing. And these were all complaints just about him, just small complaints about how he would regularly be drunk in lab or yell at people or shout racist slurs and all this stuff where it was how was this overlooked and what climate did it create in the lab? I mean, people were terrified of him. He didn't have, I think, many graduate students. I think he might have not had any because of sort of harsh climate that he had created. And he said, my job is not to deal with these behavioral issues. My job is to get grants. And he was really, really good at getting grants. He had $30 million in active grants by the time our story came out. So clearly those two things don't correlate,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right.
I wanted to ask on the journalism side, it's wonderful, of course, that BuzzFeed sort of has the institutional capacity to really tackle these stories and do a good job of them. But for a journalist at a different outlet that doesn't have those resources, or maybe an earlier career journalist who doesn't feel comfortable tackling such a big story, is there anything that they can do?
I think me and you talked about this very early on,
Yeah.
because these stories I think would be really, really hard to do as a freelancer.
Yeah.
I have, a lot of people that I could turn to on our investigations team, our national team. I have our lawyer who is not going to let something go out the door and is going to grill me and Ginny until we have everything, that it's bulletproof. And I think as a freelancer, left to your own devices, I think it would be a lot harder to do. And to, even just to pitch a place that doesn't have such a stated commitment to publishing these stories is hard. And that's much harder if you don't have a relationship with the editor, I don't know, advice, I would say pitch Ginny, but also, yeah,
But you guys can't protect freelancers, right? If a freelancer comes to you with a story, you can't necessarily protect them from the harasser suing them.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that they would be, I know that they would be held to the same standard legally, It's just it's a lot of extra work to do the sort of the legwork of getting all the corroboration necessary. I think it's more of a risk to take. But we have freelancers do features and investigations all the time, and I think.
And so there's no indemnity clause in that contract? Does anyone know?
Jenny.
Brooke. It's reasonable. Okay. Great. Brooke Rose done some great investigations. She's right there. Because yeah, I mean that's like one of the big challenges as a freelancer is that you're asked to sign an indemnity clause that basically says like if you get sued, not our problem. And like for these kinds of things, the chances of someone getting sued are not zero, right? You guys have been sued, right?
Yes, but we were sued because that same Cates sued us then to not get his investigation documents. So he had a lawsuit and then he sued us again.
Right.
He was obviously litigious. I mean, I think can maybe comment on that more. I think that I had a very brief freelancing career that did not go into sort of investigations like this, and these are tougher stories to do when you're out there on your own. And I think different places have much different ways, obviously, of dealing with it.
Yeah, a lot of places have just a pretty flat indemnity clause that basically says, right, like if you get sued, this is not our problem. Like, and also some of them even in fact say that if we get sued, you have to pay for our legal fees too, because you're asserting to us that everything in here is basically like above board. And even if it is found to be, like, you still have to pay for all that. Some places don't. Some places will protect you better. But it is kind of case by case, and pitching investigative stuff as a freelancer is really hard. And like you basically end up finding the editors that you trust too, because you also have to trust them to protect you in the way that like you all are like doing all this fact checking, and some places will not do any fact checking for you or not have any lawyers look at it before it goes out, and that's a red flag. So yeah, I mean I think it just depends case by case. I mean I've had editors tell me, I love this story, I would feel unethical actually like having you publish it here because I think you'd put yourself in danger, which I appreciate like them saying that, but it's much harder if you're a freelancer. There's like, yeah, especially now when everyone just has this like pretty horrific indemnity clause in their contract. And especially if you're just starting out, like it's tough to negotiate contracts when you like don't have a lot under your belt because they're like, who are you? Like what, so yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. Wish we had better answers for that. But
I know.
Yeah.
Thanks. I can kill time by asking another question. One of the things I kind of wanted to bring up with you both, and that we've already talked about, is that like the three of us get asked to talk about harassment a lot. And in fact, we all do other work, it turns out. Like you do other science and you report on other stories and I do other things, but like the thing that we all get asked to come and do this about is this. And so I guess I'm curious like how you feel. I mean, I for a while said no to these for a long time because I just felt like it wasn't doing anything. I mean, how do we get past like, let's all talk about harassment, and like, do you feel like these are helping? Like, should we all just go home? Like, are we helping, or like, how do we get to the next point? I mean, similarly in the stories where it's like, how do you get past just like the gruesome details into the sort of more systemic things? How do you get past just like, let's all feel good about the fact that we do this work and like have these panels and then go home? Like, what's next? What should we be doing?
And I like doing this because I get to like hear about what you do in this detail that, I've talked to her for stories before, but I don't hear about your like day-to-day work on this stuff. And so I find these valuable. I think like the other stories that I work on, I would love to be on panels all the time for them, but like, they're stories, people read them, they consume them, they're part of like an ecosystem of other stories about the same thing. And I think this in science touched on a nerve, much like, online harassment. It's like happening right now, and like a lot of people are like, holy shit, we didn't know this existed. Can you come please explain this to us? And I'm sure that time will pass. But for now, like I like doing them for the most part. Sometimes it's, yeah. You have to, I think, set a time limit too of when to stop doing them, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been tricky for me. I mean, this is different from anything I've done before. I actually really like this format, and I like that it's, and I like interfacing with folks who have, like an entirely different approach, because this is more one of your beats as opposed to like part of scholarship. And so for me, what got kind of exhausting is the number of graduate student groups who would contact me and say, please, 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 will you come out? Will you come talk to us about your research? So I go give my research talk, And it's pretty much all grad students, almost no faculty. And then the grad students say, what can we do about it? And I say, well, without any faculty in the room, that makes it kind of hard. And so there absolutely are things, I think, I was a labor organizer for throughout my time as a graduate student. Being a union organizer is actually one of the most formative experiences I had. I was a GSO at Yale, which just got their union.
Congratulations.
I was so great. I think the kind of person, there's a way where many, not all of us, but many, at least for me, my experience of grad school was I was in grad school in my 20s, which is a pretty formative, it's like when you grow up and learn how to be a grown up and be a big kid and everything. And so I was having these experiences of committing civil disobediences and getting arrested and then going to the lab and running assays. And I forget where I was going with this. Oh, right. So the thing is that for me, it's always been a priority to pay attention to these things, and I do believe very strongly in bottom-up approaches, but without institutional change, it's really hard to see a path forward. Like I was saying before about departments taking on more extra legal, like creating actual grievance committees that have real extra legal consequences for perpetrators, where you don't require some legal level in order for that to not still be okay. Like just because it's not legal sexual harassment, it's still not okay to do here. And so for me, I get kind of exhausted doing it because I don't feel like me just sharing the same scholarship is necessarily moving these departments. So the grad students are hoping I'm going to come and like be the savior, and instead it's like the people in the department have to be the saviors. It can't be me.
I have a similar experience talking about online harassment. Like publications will ask me to come in and talk about like what can you do, what can we do, blah blah blah. But it's usually junior writers ask me to come, and there are no editors in the room, and I'm like, well, if I can tell you what your editors can do to protect you, and I can tell you about all these sort of security systems that you can set up, and we can walk through some of the tech stuff, we can walk through some of this encryption, but like none of you actually are empowered to do that in your newsroom. So we're all just kind of like sharing stories, and that can be valuable, but at some point, like it's really exhausting for me to have to go through that story over and over again of like what happened and how it happened and all the stuff, and having to like move apartments and like the whole thing. So like if I'm gonna do that, I want to actually help your publication and not just like be there so that like in the same way, like people feel like they've heard about it, but no one's actually doing anything to help anybody.
Right. It feels like you're a box that they've checked.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
Instead of them actually taking
Or
responsibility.
at conferences, they're like, and now we have the online harassment panel checked off. I'm like, great, thanks. So I've just felt like, I felt kind of tired of it. Yeah.
So my question kind of builds off of that fact that sexual harassment can be so deeply embedded in institutions. And as someone who in a different lifetime has been in a lab and worked in this kind of situations, I was wondering how you can get at the smaller issues that people usually gloss over or that don't necessarily lead to an official complaint. How do you cover that as a reporter, or how do you research those things in a lab? Things like, for example, the so-called baby penalty that a lot of females on tenure track face.
What?
Never heard of it.
Yeah. Why do you think this one happened 9 years after the last one? I just got tenure. Just throwing that out there. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I think this goes back to what I was saying before about sort of broadening your lens is, again, like in the Ott case, like shining a light on the fact that he once like kicked someone out of his lab because he didn't like that he parked his bike inside, like that there are these repeated infractions and repeated sort of ways in which that behavior is excused because it's sort of beside the point. And I think it all falls into the same, it falls into a bigger bucket, but it's the same bucket, and I think in each of those cases, I think in every single one of them sort of showing that this was not, again, like an isolated incident. Not only was the sexual harassment not an isolated incident, the like behavioral issues and how they were addressed institutionally were just completely overlooked. And why that is I think like the subject of our work most generally, Mm-hmm. But yeah, I try to include that we included that in the story, even though it was not part of the point of the sexual harassment case that these two female graduate students had filed, because it was like, look, like this is the kind of person you're dealing with, and nothing was done about it, and that's sort of the context in which this stuff often occurs. So.
I do feel like your stories have done a really good job of sort of saying, like, you might think this is a small thing, but look at all these small things that were actually warning signs before this big thing happened. And you see that in all sorts of stories of, like, sexual harassment or attack or assault or anything like that. I mean, half the time it's like, oh, wow, it is weird that he was posting all of these things on the internet for years about, like, killing people. I wonder if those were warning signs. And, like, you can kind of show in these stories, it's sad that you kind of have to wait for the big thing to happen sometimes to show that all those small things actually matter, but I think your stories have done a really good job of including all of that stuff, so it doesn't feel like this is just one thing out of the blue that kind of happened without any warning.
I think Tina Gonzalez, who you brought up, I talked to her for that story, and she made so clear that, like, management, how to manage people is something we undervalue in science, and, like, that is a problem. That is a problem. That's why this story has come forward, but it is a huge problem, and it again is viewed as sort of in a separate pot somehow, but it's all part of the same thing.
Right. And I think when we don't pay attention to and take as seriously some of these smaller issues and wait for the big thing, I feel like we're again falling into the trap of paying too much attention to the legal consequences. So, for instance, I had to file a police report recently on someone who has been bothering me, and none of the actions over the last year and a half on their own would count as would meet the legal definition of harassment. None of them were actual physical threats to my person. And so, talking to the cop, he said, there's nothing we can do until he actually threatens you or actually tries to hurt you. And I was like, this seems like a problem. I don't like this very much at all. And so the fact, it's like, I think we need to pay attention to the fact that when we're and again, this is something I appreciate so much about your work, that we have to pay attention to the climate that's created and the severe consequences of it. And again, there are scholars who've been studying this around racial microaggressions, about gender and racial incivilities in the workplace and on campus for a very long time, that have shown that these have massive effects. And so at some point, hopefully the public will be more convinced that what might seem like a small throwaway comment to you is actually the 30th time that person heard that, or is part of a larger lab climate issue that is a real problem.
And you see that in terms of how domestic violence is defined, how that definition has changed over time. And Maryland just changed their laws to say that it doesn't. They used to require that for it to be classified as rape, a woman had to physically fight back, and like literally that just changed like a month ago. These standards are the boxes to check will change, and that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your excellent and very unique contributions. Some of us came down here from Columbia Neuroscience, and my question relates to, I was at a conference not too long ago, a scientific conference, and there were 4 panelists, 3 scientists, like senior lab heads, and 1 lawyer. And I asked them a question about Title IX and how it operates independently of funding from NIH or NSF. And they looked at me like I'd just asked about UFO sightings or something. They had no idea. They didn't know about the problem. They hadn't read any of the articles. They didn't know about Marcy or Slater or Jackie Spears' House resolution to connect funding to Title IX. So to what extent do you think there's a knowledge deficit that could be solved between like the people who are already entrenched in departments and this problem, and how can we solve that?
I mean, privilege makes you blind to lots of stuff, and that's kind of the problem that a lot of us face. I'm sure journalists face in the way that they try to cover things, that scholars face when we're trying to convince people that our work matters. And so, yeah, I think there are still, weirdly enough, people who have not heard that sexual harassment happens in the sciences, or that it happens at all. We recently, in a paper that is now in revision and resubmitted to a journal, in a previous journal we sent it to, this is not the SAFE study, this is a different project, it got sent out to scholars in the field as opposed to social scientists who study workplace aggression. So it, it went out to that discipline. And so somebody from that discipline reviewed the paper and said, I have absolutely no expertise in this, but I also want to say I've never seen this happen in my field. And so therefore, I don't believe this quantitative data that you guys gathered in a very rigorous way because I've never seen it happen. And the editor did nothing. The editor let that review stand and made us try to respond to it, which is how we knew maybe we shouldn't keep trying with this journal. And we ended up with, eventually, after several rounds of review, giving up and withdrawing it and sending it somewhere else. There's a whole other conversation that we can have about how long it takes to publish this work. That it's 2017, and I still have 2 papers that I'm trying to publish that I've been trying for years, to get published. But the thing that's so yeah, there's people who are going to be willfully ignorant or accidentally ignorant, and I don't know how. I don't have a great handle on how to reach them. I don't know if you guys have insight.
I mean, I think this gets back to the problem we were talking about earlier, which is that like the grad students who know this is a problem invite you, and like the sort of junior staff who know it's a problem want to, have people come in and talk about it, and the editors who maybe have no idea that it's a problem, or the faculty who have no idea it's a problem, aren't in that room, right? They're not listening to it. I do think that it's the fact that you're publishing at BuzzFeed is actually like a boon to this, like because people sort of who don't it's not a science publication. So I think anytime there's a story like this in a non-science publication is very helpful in general to like broadening that reach. But I mean, obviously, there's the double-edged sword there because some people think BuzzFeed's only for cat videos,
right.
which it's obviously not.
But then it's like gratifying to see like Science and Nature publishing these stories. I actually reread the Nature story on your SAFE study today, and it was so funny because they were like, here are the results, which are sort of shocking. Like 64% of people have experienced sexual harassment, 22% have experienced assault, and then it ends with 2 quotes from people who are like, yeah, no, that's not really a problem. I don't think that's real,
That
and
wasn't
it was
my
like
favorite
in Nature,
coverage.
and I think
it wasn't my favorite.
I think I'm pretty sure that would not happen today. So that's at least some progress. But to go back to your question, there's the level of how much like faculty members don't know this is a problem, and then there's the level of like NIH. And these are like different, and well, the faculty members, the institutions, and then NIH, right, the funders. And I think Jackie Spear, which if anyone here doesn't know, Jackie Spear is a congresswoman who's trying to introduce legislation to make it so that federal grant givers have to be notified about any investigations of sexual harassment. They have to account for that when they decide who to give grants to. And this is, sort of putting an external accountability measure in when, we have seen that institutions might have reasons to not act. Well, maybe if we put someone a step higher that sort of has levers to pull and it's like the right levers, maybe some of this will change. And I think that, it's an interesting approach. But yeah, I've called NIH a lot about this, and they're sort of hands off. They're like, we'll punt you to like, again, the legal thing. We'll punt you to like the one Office of Civil Rights that deals with these issues. It turns out they don't get any complaints about this ever because it's so hard to go that high. Like, who is going to know what obscure office to go to that will like draw attention to this problem at like that high of a level when they can't even, often know who their Title IX coordinator is. So
it does also maybe make the argument for bundling it with workplace safety, because lawyers really care about workplace safety, because that means they might get sued for something in a way that they maybe don't care about some of this other stuff. So in some ways that might be an argument for that, because if it was the same as, somebody burns themselves, I bet you that lawyer in that room would know a lot more about it. Let's take just a quick second. Can we turn the live stream off so people can ask questions if they don't feel like being on camera? On camera? On camera? On camera?